we've talked a lot about the positive aspects, but I wondered, Mounir, are there any other barriers that you think are notable? A lack of regulation can be one, but are there other barriers that you see to, the proliferation of open banking?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and be succinct in naming them, and the rest of the folks on the panel, I think, also feel strongly about these points and can chime in. Open banking on its own in a vacuum as a set of standards, and it's already been said, it is sort of not enough to drive adoption and deliver on the promise of access to financial services for people. One of the biggest problems that we have is around identity and authentication. The authentication models today of redirect and decoupled are pretty bad when it comes to the user experience. They are likely to involve a lot of drop-offs, and this is probably what you're seeing. There's the sort of infamous chart of a 90-day re-authentication for AISP users, and you can see that it just drops off a cliff. And PISP, if in the middle of a checkout you have to redirect, you can expect that you will see equally huge drop-offs, and hence the adoption is not likely to be huge when you compare it to the incumbent, which is card solutions. The other thing is these things already have solutions to them. First off, there are things like identity proxies that you can use, or payment credential proxies that you can use, so that you're not just freely sharing your bank account details. And when you use the example of the amazing work that the NPCI did in India, where you just have a phone number and you use that as a proxy to pay anyone. In a similar way, authentication can be something that can be, even two-factor can be done through passive authentication means that various authenticators, hardware authenticators or otherwise, can provide. But there isn't a standard to allow for that to happen. Which is a good segue to the second point, which is that today open banking is all sticks and no carrots for the banks. So there isn't really an incentive for the banks to invest and cooperate to build those authentication models to start with. And we're basically forcing them to open up their data. We're probably going to start cannibalizing the card payments and the revenue they get from that to use bank accounts as a form of payment. And there really isn't an incentive yet for the banks, and there very well could be. And I don't know if it has to be regulated or market driven, but you could have open APIs for the origination of instant loans, for access to lines of credit at the point of transaction, etc. There's no reason why things like this can't be in place to make open banking more attractive to the banks. And I promise to shut up after that last point. The third issue is an issue of technical complexity. And if I go back to your first question on this panel, which is around the best use cases, for me personally, because it appeals to my sort of appetite for scalability, the real heroes in open banking today are the people creating the building blocks to make it accessible to everyone. It's people like TrueLayer and Plaid who are democratizing the access to the APIs, despite the fact that you have a crazy proliferation of standards, at least outside the UK, and sandboxes that even today in many countries are barely accessible for a lot of the banks. And these building blocks are required. If you look at I mentioned India before, if you look at UPI, it is a managed service. You plug in through your PSP and it gives you access to IMPS, it gives you access to UPI in general. And ideally we have something like that makes it easier for the SMBs or the rising FinTechs to be a part of this rather than having to integrate with 100 API endpoints across banks.
Well, I'd love to hear, Joshua and Amit's view there. I mean, I wonder, maybe I'll start with Joshua, just, Revolut having started in London and now, and also with operations in Lithuania and elsewhere, what barriers do you see, for open banking catching on more widely?
I mean, I completely agree with what Mounir was saying, that we need to be better at thinking of the end consumer. And we've been making this point, and it seems so obvious, but sometimes we forget that all of open banking is for the end consumer. And if the end consumer is, first of all, there's no value for them to use it. If the flow is too difficult for them, the UX is not good, they're not going to use it. And if the end consumer does not use it, open banking is a failure. I mean, we have to call that out. And just before just before coming on this call, I was talking to some of the guys at Trulia, and although UK has done quite a good experience when it comes to the app-to-app authentication, as it were, a lot of the European countries still, I mean, we are looking at like Germany and Lithuania, for example. There's literally 3-4 screens that the user has to go through before they can even connect an account. So this almost, makes open banking redundant in those countries. And if we're just going to say that, oh, open banking is ready, it's not ready until the user can actually use it and find value in it. So I think UX end to end is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we should overcome.
Got it. Well, Amit, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely right. User experience and journeys are key. One of the reasons why I think payment APIs have not really caught on is all of the challenges which Mounir talked about. The experience which you get with open banking payments is substandard than what you get in the market. Google Pay, Apple Pay, contactless is far more advanced, sophisticated, superior, and truly customer-centric in every sense. Why would I use open banking payment APIs? So clearly, there are gaps and holes to be plugged on that space. Second thing I think is there is still too much of fragmentation even within countries. Even we talk about PSD2, but PSD2 is actually Poland Group STAT. It's the Polish API standard. There's 6 or 7 different standards proliferating around, creating too much of confusion around the market and making it really difficult for the FinTech to actually do stuff with it, because it's expensive to do 7 integrations as against 1 where you have a consistent standard. So fragmentation. Last and the most important thing and is for me is customer education. I don't think the big banks are just doing enough to educate their customers about what is open banking and what are the benefits for them. Why should they be involved in it? I remember back in 2017, I actually had to call up my bank and say, hey, by law, I'm supposed to actually get a letter or an email from you telling me that this is open banking and this is what my rights are within the space, and why haven't you done so? And then they send me a letter within 2 days, and we are talking about a big high street bank. So this is the reality of financial services. They have. I hear that the top 9 UK banks have spent 1.5 billion in building tech to support open banking, probably to modernize their legacy infrastructure. But they haven't. I don't think they've even spent 1/100th of that in customer education.